Hello, Christian history class, and welcome to this online version of our class today. In this class, we're going to continue to talk about the challenges that were facing the church in the 11th and 12th centuries, and we're going to cover a period that runs up from about the beginning of the 11th century all the way up towards the beginning of the middle of the 13th century and the beginning of scholasticism. So remember that in prior lectures we've talked about some of the growing differences between the church in the East and the church in the West. Some of those differences had to do with practices, the way certain things were practiced in the churches. For example, the use of leavened or unleavened bread as part of the Eucharist. Some of them had to do with spirituality and theology. We saw this debate over the use of icons and how kind of the center of gravity shifted, where some in the East actually, some of the political powers in the East disfavored icons, while the monastic powers favored icons, whereas in the West icons were favored, and how that sort of shifted, and with Charlemagne, how that shifted significantly, where icons were more respected in the East than they were in the West. We saw the pressures that were being put on the East in particular by the rise of Islam and the military and political pressures that were being put on the East, and some of the isolation of the East as a result of some of those political pressures. So we saw some of those theological differences, some of those differences in practice, some of those cultural differences, some of those differences that are simply relating to political and military pressure and increasing isolation as a result of those pressures. And these tensions kind of come to a head as we move toward the Great Schism of 1054. Now, as we move toward that schism, there is an effort between the West and the East to reach some kind of compromise. And in 1054, Pope Leo sent papal envoys to Constantinople, led by Cardinal Humbert, Humbert, to try and negotiate some of these differences. And this delegation is received by the Byzantine emperor, but is not received by the Byzantine patriarch in Constantinople, Celarius. So Celarius is the religious authority in Constantinople who is not initially receiving these envoys. The emperor is receiving the envoys. They're having these discussions, and they're covering all of these issues, all these differences in practice, all these differences in theology. They're covering some of these differences in ecclesiology. So remember also that the Roman bishop, the Pope, is asserting at least some kind of primacy among the bishops, and the bishop in the patriarch in Constantinople is trying to argue that all of the historic sees have an equality in administration, even if the Roman bishop has some kind of primacy in respect. So these debates go on. They really don't succeed. They fail to produce any compromise. They fail to produce any change in either party's position. And then a kind of dramatic event happens. Cardinal Humbert, who is leading the papal delegation, draws up a bull of excommunication, and a bull is just a kind of official or legal document of excommunication, excommunicating Patriarch Celarius. So here is a representative of the Roman bishop acting to put the Patriarch of the East out of the church. It says it's a very kind of dramatic, a dramatic event. Now, there's sort of a strange political backstory to this, because Humbert is he's acting with authority of the Pope in a sense, but at this point actually Pope Leo had died, and it's not even clear whether Humbert had gotten word of Leo's death, and what authority he actually had. So there's sort of a lot of confusion going on, but in any event, things had really grown apart. there is this excommunication. There is then an excommunication of the Pope back from the eastern side, and there is really a formal schism between these churches. There really is no longer communion between these two churches, and so we call this event the Great Schism, and it's really kind of the formal division between the Western or Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, we mentioned that at the same time that these religious tensions are happening, there are political tensions because of the pressure that Islam is putting on the empire in the East. And shortly after the Great Schism, there is in fact a Muslim Turkish invasion of the area that we would now consider Armenia. So there's a very significant incursion, and it's really threatening kind of the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine response fails. The Byzantines tried to put together an army to counter the Turks, and that army is essentially destroyed, and it really leaves the border of the empire without really any kind of effective defense. So you've got this Muslim Turkish force, which is kind of sweeping up through this area, and now which is seemingly prepared to utterly destroy the Byzantine Empire. In fact, it appears that the Muslim Turks are gaining enough strength and are putting enough pressure on the Byzantine Empire that they might even be poised to invade Constantinople itself, and this is a great crisis. So in Constantinople at the time, the political leadership appeals to the West and says, we need help. We need military, political help to deal with this threat of Islam. So despite the fact that there is formal schism between the church in the East and the church in the West, the emperor in the East reaches out to the Pope in the West and asks for support and for help. What he gets in response is not exactly what he expected, which is the Pope's call for the First Crusade. Before we talk about the launch of the First Crusade itself, however, we have to step back a couple of decades and talk about what is going on politically and ecclesiologically in the West. And if you recall last class, we talked about in 1075, Pope Gregory's issuing of the Dictus Papae. And remember, the Dictus Papae is a document in which, a legal sort of document in which the Pope is asserting his authority over the church. The Roman bishop is asserting a kind of formal primacy over the church. And it's kind of, in some sense, reflecting the tensions in the schism between the East and West, the Roman bishop kind of asserting, yes, I have sort of the final primacy over the church, but also suggesting that the Pope has a kind of temporal authority. So the Dictus Papae is also a document in which the Pope is asserting the responsibility and authority for the spiritual and political well-being of the whole of the commonweal, of the commonwealth. This assertion of authority, which had been kind of bubbling up for a number of years, even before the Dictus Papae, leads to a controversy called the investiture controversy. So the investiture controversy relates to who has the right to invest authority in leaders of the church. And, by invest here, we mean kind of give authority, put authority into. If you think about investing your money, you're taking that money and you're putting it into a certain account, and you're in effect authorizing that money to do certain kinds of work. So it's a formal recognition and giving of authority and power. And the question here was, who could appoint bishops and to have a responsibility over cities, over monasteries, and so on. And you have to realize that the bishop is an incredibly important figure in this period. People don't only look to the bishop for sort of vague spiritual advice, but the bishop sort of holds, in a sense, the spiritual authority over the whole commonwealth, and has a lot of sway over what the ordinary people do, and in particular has a lot of sway over the respect that ordinary people give to their political rulers. So the ability to control who is the bishop can have a very significant impact on the ability to control or influence the extent to which people are doing the will of the political sovereign. So once again, this is a question of the authority of the church in relation to the authority of the state, of the governing power. The nobility at the time, the princes, the lords, the kind of high political officials of the time, want to have the authority to invest the bishops in their local territory. Now, part of this also had to do with the kind of benefits or spoils that would go to an office like bishop. We might tend to think today that, well, having a high position in a church, there might be a variety of reasons why somebody might want that, but it may well be that money and power isn't one of them. Although maybe in many churches, money and power still even today could be one of them. Certainly in this period of time, the bishop had a lot of authority. The bishop tended to be well fed. The bishop tended to be well cared for, and so a noble family that had kind of one son who was the prince or the lord might want to have another son who is the bishop, and that's sort of a way of taking care of that family and consolidating that family's power. So there were these practices of giving bishoprics to people who really weren't necessarily spiritually qualified for them, but who were, really for political reasons. The political authorities at the time also realized that because of the value of these offices, people would be willing to pay for these offices. So a wealthy or influential family that wanted to have a son placed as a bishop would be willing to pay the authority who had the ability to appoint that bishop. So it was a source of revenue. This practice was called simony. So this practice of simony was a relatively common practice, and it was one that was certainly recognized by some reformers within the church as being a real problem. I mean, a bishop or a spiritual authority should be appointed for reasons that are appropriate to that office, not because someone is able to buy it. So we have this ongoing dispute about whether it is the religious authority, the Pope, who can invest the bishops, or whether it is the temporal authorities who can invest the bishops. Now, also at the same time, in kind of an ironic twist, we have serious tensions between, in particular in Germany, between the lesser nobility, princes, lords, and so on, and the German king. So a kind of significant factions of the German nobility are not happy with the king and are trying to find ways to kind of undermine the king's authority. So the king at the time, King Henry IV, took a really bold move and appointed his favorite as archbishop in Milan. The Pope, Pope Gregory VII, disfavored this appointment. Now, this is in 1075, which again, remember, is the year of the Dictus Papae. So the king and the Pope hold competing councils. The king asserts that he has authority to appoint this archbishop, and Gregory does not. Gregory asserts that he has the authority and the king does not, and further, Gregory, the Pope, excommunicates the king. The German nobility, remember there are tensions between kind of the lesser nobility and the king, see this as an opportunity to get rid of the king. So the German nobility recognize the Pope's excommunication of the king and they begin to take moves to have the king deposed or removed from the throne. So the king then kind of ironically recognizes that unless he gives in to the authority of the Pope over this question of investiture, he's very likely to lose his crown to these nobles. So in order to preserve his temporal power over these other nobles, King Henry has to kind of go forward and recognize the authority of the Pope. And this happens in really, really dramatic fashion at a castle in Canossa, where the Pope was staying. So the King Henry dresses as a penitent. He dresses in rags, he goes barefoot, and he stands in the snow outside of the Pope's castle at Canossa, asking and begging the Pope for forgiveness. And really, the Pope doesn't want to do this. The Pope doesn't really want to recognize Henry's authority either, but kind of given the drama of this scene, the Pope kind of feels like he has no choice but to sort of come out and remove the excommunication of King Henry and recognize King Henry's authority. So it's a very kind of ironic twist within the investiture controversy where the temporal authority in fact recognizes the religious authority and the ability of the religious authority to appoint these bishops, and kind of recognizes a sense of separation or a sense of different domains of authority between church and state in an effort to save the temporal authority. Unfortunately for Henry, this really didn't work out too well. The nobles still opposed Henry. There continued to be strife and conflict, and in fact, Henry had to, it was effectively a kind of civil war, and Henry had to use military action to subdue his rivals. And indeed, Henry ends up marching on Rome itself. Now, I mean, it's difficult for us, and we've said this a number of times in this class, to kind of put ourselves back into how dramatic this kind of situation is. Now, the Pope, Gregory, is not happy with this situation of Henry marching on Rome, so the Pope once again excommunicates Henry. Well, at this point, Henry is not really willing to give in to what the Pope does, so Henry goes ahead and secures the election of a Pope that Henry chooses, who is sort of loyal to Henry. Pope Gregory was then forced into exile, where he eventually died. Now, over time, this controversy about investiture worked itself out in a way that began to recognize distinctions in the sphere of authority of the church and the sphere of authority of the state, but it takes some time to work those things out in some detail. So all of these things, the assertions of papal authority in the Great Schism of 1054, the assertions of papal authority in the investiture controversy, this tension between ecclesiastical and political power, form the background for the launch of the First Crusade. So we had in our primary source readings this week accounts of Pope Urban's call in Clermont for the First Crusade, and it's important to kind of read through this text and see what is Urban using to motivate people? How did people become motivated to go on crusade? The First Crusade, as the text book suggests to us, was a popular movement. It was fueled from on high by Pope Urban, but it became this sort of growing grassroots movement, this sort of boulder rolling down a hill. So there were nobility knights involved, but they attracted to them large bands of peasants as they kind of went through the countryside, gathering together their army. Thousands, tens of thousands of sort of ordinary people decided to go on this quest, really to them sort of across the known world, putting themselves at risk in an army when they're not professional soldiers? Why did they do this? And, if you look at Urban's call, it is at one level a deeply emotional call. It is recognizing, in some sense recognizing rightly, the peril in which fellow Christians are placed by the threat of invading Muslim armies. There was a real threat, and as we have seen, the Islamic caliphates at the time were expansionist, and they were putting military pressure on the East, and they were sort of poised and threatening, perhaps even to invade Constantinople itself. So there was this threat, and there was sort of this call, and there had been this call from the East for help. But notice further the religious motivation that Pope Urban puts into this text. And notice in particular in the account given by Fulcher of Chartres, right, all who die by the way, whether by land or sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. The kind of theological context is that the Pope, seeing himself as having the keys of Peter given to Peter by Christ, is stating that he has the ability directly to remit sins. And anyone who participates in this and who dies effectively as a martyr in battle will have all their sins forgiven. This concept that the Pope ultimately has the ability directly to remit sins for certain acts done or for other reasons is called an indulgence. The practice of granting indulgences is going to play a very important role in the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. It is really one of the most basic practices that Martin Luther was objecting to in his 95 Theses, and we'll get to that later on in the semester. But the practice doesn't begin with the Crusades, but notice how it is deployed, how it is used in the Crusades. It is used to motivate Christendom to march on these temporal enemies. This promise of spiritual benefit is used as a way of motivating people to do things that affect the temporal realm, even the political realm, and affect it militarily. Now, we've talked a little bit during this semester about millennialism during this period, about kind of the apocalyptic imagination during this period. And you also need to see that context as part of what is motivating people. There is a deep sense of fear, a deep sense of crisis, a deep sense that the world very well may be on the verge of coming to an end. Almost an Armageddon-like quality to the thought about the battle and the battles that are about to happen. So this motivates individual, this sense of crisis, this sense of apocalyptic, this sense that the millennium may be upon us, motivates people to leave home and family and work and to join kind of these ragtag armies and to seek really salvation. There also are more base and temporal motivations for this, because certainly among the nobility there was among the knight classes and the kind of professional soldiers and the nobility, there was a recognition that taking part in this kind of military action gives the promise of expanding your territory, gives the promise of obtaining new territories in new places. And this kind of marriage between the church and the military / state apparatus not only involves the possibility of having sins forgiven, but also involves the ability of gaining new territory. And for the average crusader, the average kind of peasant who joins the crusade, there is also this sense of either kind of life in the village or potentially this life of adventure and perhaps even fortune if you do manage to survive. And if you don't manage to survive, then remission of sins and the promise of heaven. So all of this kind of powerful imaginary, the reasons that we might think of as somewhat legitimate in kind of anachronistic terms, we have to really sort of be careful about making judgments about history, about what's going on kind of historically. But the real military threat, as well as this mix of apocalyptic imagination and possible temporal benefits and possible heavenly benefits, all fuel this move toward crusade. So you have then, after Pope Urban's call for the crusade, various nobles kind of raising armies, raising money, raising funds, and then kind of sweeping towards the east, gathering with them peasants who are willing to fight in the army. And you have all of these various nobles with their armies kind of congregating at Constantinople as sort of the de facto place where they would gather to begin to launch their campaign to recapture Jerusalem. Now remember that it's in many ways the conquest of the siege of Jerusalem by the Muslim armies and the ultimate taking of Jerusalem by the Muslim armies that is part of what catalyzes this apocalyptic imagination, this notion that Jerusalem is kind of the heart of this sort of spiritual center of the historic faith, and that this spiritual center is now in the hands of these Islamic armies, really fuels this imagination and the senses that the Christian armies, the crusading armies, need to retake Jerusalem. But they're gathering in Constantinople, and this is not really what the emperor in Constantinople was expecting or wanted. What they were expecting or wanted was troops and material and support that could remain under Byzantine control. But now you have these camps and armies that are encamped around Constantinople who are not under Byzantine control. Remember, we've got ecclesiastical schism already. We've got political tensions already. And so the emperor in Constantinople is getting worried that what are these armies going to do that are camped outside of Constantinople? Are they going to in fact try to take Constantinople? Or are they going to in fact assert military and political authority over the Byzantine Empire? So the emperor Alexius Comnenus sought and received oaths of loyalty from the leaders of the crusading armies, indicating that they would be loyal to the emperor in the east, that they would support the emperor in the east, that they would not, that they were on a spiritual and military crusade to liberate Jerusalem, and that they would not appropriate for themselves areas that properly belong to the Byzantine Empire. Now, although they gave that oath, the concern proved to be an important one. And as we continue to sort of talk about the Crusades, we will see how that tension in later Crusades really boils over and really boils into kind of war not only against Islam, but war within Christendom. So as the text denotes, the main body of the crusading army did march into Antioch and took Antioch after a very long siege, and then also recaptured Jerusalem. The siege and capture of Antioch and Jerusalem were absolutely brutal affairs. When the Crusaders finally did break into Jerusalem, they looted, burned, pillaged, raped. They slaughtered all of the Muslim inhabitants. They burned down the Jewish synagogue as well. There's a significant undercurrent, an element in the Crusades that is not only crusading against Islam, but is also deeply anti-Semitic, deeply anti-Jewish. And there are numbers of reports as the crusading armies even are kind of moving through Europe toward the east of destroying synagogues and slaughtering Jews. One of the crusading soldiers who kept an account of these events described it this way, and this is a quote from his account. "With the fall of Jerusalem and its towers, one could see marvelous works. Some of the pagans were mercifully beheaded, others pierced by arrows plunged from the towers, and yet others tortured for a long time were burned to death in searing flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet lay in the houses and streets, and men and knights were running to and fro over the corpses." A contemporary historian of the Crusades, Thomas Asbridge, describes the aftermath of the siege and capture of Jerusalem this way. "In the midsummer heat, the stench soon became intolerable. The dead were dragged out beyond the city walls, piled up in mounds as big as houses, and burned. Even 6 months later, a Latin visiting Palestine for the first time commented that the holy city still reeked of death and decay."